The story begins in France, introducing a man named Frank, who works as a quality control inspector for high-rise buildings. That day, Frank and his wife, Leo, at the hospital for a prenatal checkup. Apparently, Leo is 8 months pregnant, with only a few days left until her due date. Returning home from the hospital, they are shocked to find their apartment in complete disarray, as if someone had deliberately ransacked it in search of something. Moments later, Frank meets up with his best friend, Ben. From their conversation, the people who trashed Frank's apartment were searching for a key that he has hidden away. Several days later, while Frank and a colleague are working, Frank nearly falls from the building. He notices a suspicious man hurriedly descending the structure. Frank quickly follows and chases the man, but the bald stranger escapes. Concerned that he hasn't heard from Leo all day, Frank rushes home. Upon arriving, Frank is relieved to find Leo safe and sound. Meanwhile, a white-haired man is seen boarding a waiting car. Inside the vehicle is the same bald man who had escaped from Frank earlier. Moments later, the white-haired man coldly eliminates the bald man. That night, after Leo falls asleep, Frank quietly climbs to the rooftop of their apartment building to check on the hidden key. Though the purpose of the key remains unclear, one thing is certain. It is immensely valuable, and Frank is determined to keep it out of the wrong hands. As Frank attempts to relocate the key's hiding spot inside a sink, Leo suddenly appears, catching him in the act. She confronts him, questioning why he has been so restless lately and why he's been spending nights on the rooftop instead of sleeping beside her. Just as Leo demands to know what Frank is hiding from her, a sudden knock at the door startles them. At the same time, masked intruders burst into their apartment, forcing their way inside. From the way Frank and Leo fight back, it becomes evident that they are no ordinary couple. Despite their efforts in successfully subduing a few of the intruders, they are ultimately overpowered by the sheer number of attackers. After tying up Frank, one of the masked men presses a gun against his hand to obtain his fingerprint. It is then revealed that the mastermind behind this attack is the white-haired man from earlier, the one who had eliminated his own failed subordinate. The man revealed to be Van Naken, a ruthless mercenary hired to retrieve the key from Frank. Since Frank refuses to hand over the key, Van Naken hacks into Frank's phone and pockets it. Before incapacitating him, Van Naken orders his men to sedate Leo and take her away. The scene then shifts back to 2014, where a group of newly graduated elite Jiajian officers are being welcomed by their families and senior colleagues. Among these officers are Frank and Leo, who at the time are not yet in a relationship. At that moment, Frank stands out as one of the top graduates of his class. After being introduced to the wife of one of his fellow graduates, Nico, Frank is approached by his superior, Astro. At that moment, Astro presents Frank with a badge inscribed with the words Ad Vitam on the back, a badge that once belonged to Frank's father during his service. 2 years later, during the recruitment of new Jiajian elite forces, Ben is seen undergoing a series of tests to become an officer like Frank. In the final test, Ben is required to shoot a target placed on the chest of a senior, Frank. Fortunately, Ben hits the target perfectly, earning him the title of the best graduate of the elite forces that year. During the graduation celebration, Ben, who isn't particularly close to his peers, is seen accompanied by Leo. Apparently, Leo understands that Ben's status as an immigrant might make it difficult for him to connect with others. Seeing Ben finally mingling with his comrades, Frank seizes the opportunity to approach Leo, worried that she might develop feelings for Ben. Without wasting time, Frank confesses that he has feelings for her. To his delight, Leo reveals that she has liked Frank for the past 2 years, and their conversation ends romantically in a restroom. However, just as the romantic moment is about to unfold, Ben, heavily drunk and on the verge of vomiting, suddenly barges into the restroom. Later that night, as Frank heads home with Nico and his wife, Manon, Nico teases Frank, asking if he and Leo will spend the night together. From that day on, Frank and Leo officially begin their relationship, which is warmly welcomed by Ben, Nico, and Manon. A week later, after a training session, Frank receives a call from Eric, a room attendant at the Trianon Hotel. Eric reports hearing gunshots coming from one of the rooms. Acting on this information, Frank rushes to the hotel with Nico and Ben. While gathering details from the hotel manager, They're suddenly ambushed by two suspects, who manage to shoot both Ben and Nico. After subduing the attackers, Frank immediately tends to the severely wounded Nico. Tragically, Nico succumbs to his injuries and passes away. The next day, Frank is reprimanded by his superior, Astro, for acting recklessly without waiting for orders, which resulted in two officers being shot, one of whom tragically lost his life. Due to his actions, Astro is forced to ask Frank to resign from their unit. After taking one last look at his father's photo in the headquarters, Frank heads to the locker room to pack up his belongings. The following day, after Nico's funeral, Frank notices Leo having a serious conversation with Astro, their superior. It turns out that Leo also intends to leave the GIGN after witnessing the tragedy that befell Nico. Sometime later, Frank visits Ben, who is still recovering from his injuries. While there, they come across a social media post suggesting that the shooters at the Triton Hotel were police officers. However, the claim is quickly dismissed due to a lack of evidence. Hearing this, Ben advises Frank to stay out of the matter. It's also revealed that Ben's injuries are severe enough to prevent him from performing physically demanding tasks. He is reassigned to an administrative role, but ultimately decides to resign. Learning this only deepens Frank's guilt. One evening, while having dinner at a restaurant, Leo reveals to Frank that she is pregnant with their child. To prepare for the baby's arrival, Leo and Frank decide to move to a larger apartment. While packing their belongings, Frank accidentally discovers his badge, stained with the blood of one of the shooters from the Triton Hotel incident. Curious about the shooter's identity, Frank had asked a friend, a forensic doctor with the police, to analyze the DNA. Later, Frank meets with Ben and shares that one of the shooters is a former Special Forces operative named Salim. Since Salim is known to work with the Directorate of Security and collaborates with multiple government ministries, Frank realizes that the tourist found dead at the hotel was no ordinary visitor. Once again, Ben advises Frank to stay out of the matter. Taking Ben's advice, Frank stores the information about Salim in a locker and hides the locker key on the rooftop of his apartment. This revelation finally uncovers the truth. The key Frank has been hiding all along is the key to that locker. Sometime later, unable to suppress his need to uncover the possible conspiracy behind the Triton case, Frank meets with a journalist to discuss the matter. He insists on keeping his identity confidential. After reaching an agreement, Frank promises to hand over the evidence he has gathered. Sometime later, at the ministry office, the head of the Directorate of Security meets with the minister. During their conversation, they explain that 7 months ago, Colonel John Brennan, a former American officer now working with the CIA, arrived in France with a security detail, intending to negotiate an arms deal with Australia. On that day, 2 staff members from the Directorate of Security, one of whom was Salim, were tasked with entering John's hotel room to retrieve certain important documents. However, things did not go as planned when John and his guard unexpectedly returned to the room, forcing Salim and his accomplice to shoot them. Not only that, they also reveal that a former GIGN operative named Frank possesses evidence implicating the Directorate of Security after analyzing the bloodstain left by Salim on Frank's badge. This information was obtained from an informant who works as a journalist at the same media outlet as the reporter Frank had contacted. The minister realizes that if this information reaches the CIA, it could severely strain diplomatic relations between France and the United States. As a result, she orders the 2 men before her to retrieve the evidence Frank has and then eliminate him to silence any witnesses. In the present, after Van Naken successfully kidnaps Leo, Frank, who has just regained consciousness, receives a call from Van Naken, who shows him the condition of his wife. During the call, Van Naken threatens Frank, demanding that he hand over the hidden evidence within 4 hours, or Leo will be killed. Before ending the call, Van Naken warns Frank not to involve the police, as it would be futile. It turns out that Frank has been framed as a fugitive after Van Naken used his fingerprint, obtained from a weapon, to pin the murder of Van Naken's men on him. Not wanting to waste any time, Frank cleans himself up and heads straight to his apartment to retrieve the key he had hidden in the bathroom sink. However, as he approaches the apartment, he is startled to find several police officers stationed there. When Frank goes to retrieve the key, he is shocked to discover it is no longer there. Moments later, he is spotted by an officer, forcing Frank to fight his way out and escape. After successfully evading the police, Frank rushes to Ben's workplace and explains everything that has happened. Realizing that the locker key is missing and that Frank needs the bloodstained GIGN badge, Ben takes Frank to his home and gives him his own GIGN badge. Frank smears his own blood on the badge, intending to deceive Van Naken's group and use it as leverage to rescue Leo. Not long after, Frank and Ben made their way to a meeting point deep within the forest. To ensure their presence remained undetected, Ben deliberately stepped out of the vehicle before reaching the location and discreetly planted a tracking device, or GPS, on Frank. Upon arriving at Van Naken's hideout, Frank was immediately restrained, his arms bound by Van Naken's henchmen. When Frank finally came face-to-face with Van Naken, he confiscated Frank's phone and led him to Leo, who was being held captive in the heart of the forest. After obtaining the bloodstained badge he had been searching for, Van Naken ordered his men to power on Frank's phone. He then instructed them to send a message to all of Frank's contacts, threatening harm to his wife and child if Frank refused to comply. The message was crafted to make it appear as though Frank had killed Leo before doing the unthinkable. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Van Naken, the police, who were already searching for Frank, received a notification from the activated GPS on the phone. With his plan in motion, Van Naken left the scene, leaving behind 3 of his men to execute Frank and Leo. Just as the situation seemed dire, Ben appeared, wearing a mask, and managed to rescue them. Frank, Leo, and Ben quickly commandeered a car and sped away, desperate to escape. A tense chase ensued, punctuated by bursts of gunfire. During the chaos, Leo was struck by a bullet, sustaining a severe injury to her arm. As Frank tended to her wound, trying to stop the bleeding, Leo's water suddenly broke, a clear sign that she was going into labor. Seeing this, Frank urged Ben to take Leo to the hospital, then leapt out of the car to slow down Van Naken's men, who were hot on their trail. In the midst of a fierce gunfight with Frank, Van Naken ordered his men to continue pursuing Ben's car. Frank, now on a stolen Forest Ranger's motorcycle, attempted to flee, but Van Naken was relentless, chasing him from behind. Inside the car, Ben noticed Leo growing increasingly pale and unresponsive. He tried to keep her conscious by talking to her, but her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Meanwhile, Van Naken's men were still in pursuit, closing in on them. To make matters worse, Frank was now not only being chased by Van Naken, but also by the police. In a daring move, Frank stole a paramotor from a farmer and once again managed to escape, this time taking to the skies. While airborne, Frank contacted Ben to check on Leo's condition. It was clear that Leo was fading fast, slipping in and out of consciousness. After ending the call, it became apparent that Ben himself was seriously injured, his body battered and bleeding. Elsewhere, Astro, Frank, and Ben's former superior received a call ordering him to put an end to the escape of his former subordinates. Astro immediately mobilized his team to intervene. Ben, still being pursued by Van Naken's men, did everything in his power to reach the hospital, guided by Frank from above, who directed him through shortcuts. Just as Ben pulled into the hospital parking lot, Van Naken appeared, pointing a gun directly at him. Fortunately, Frank arrived just in time. As he was about to finish off Van Naken, his former superior, Astro, suddenly appeared with a team of soldiers surrounding them. Unfazed by the risk of being shot, Frank rushed into the car, carrying his wife, who was on the brink of death, into the hospital. After Leo received medical attention from the doctors, Astro took Frank into custody to hold him accountable for his alleged actions, including the killing of Van Naken's men. 1 month later, Frank was visibly moved when Leo and their newborn child came to visit him. In that heartfelt moment, Leo revealed that the key Frank had hidden had actually been secured by her during the fight against Van Naken's forces. A few days earlier, Leo had also submitted the evidence to the government. As a result, Frank was cleared of all charges, as his actions were deemed self-defense. He was also acquitted of any involvement in the deaths of Van Naken's men. In the final scene of the film, Frank and Leo shared a warm embrace. From a distance, Ben, now fully recovered, watched them with a smile, happy to see their joy. And with that, the film came to a close. Moral lesson from the story: Always hide your keys in a place where even your pregnant wife can't find them, because if she does, you might end up fighting mercenaries while she goes into labor. Also, if your best friend is bad at shooting, don't let him practice on you. It could save you a lot of trouble in a rooftop chase.